one of the first things that I thought about is obviously talking about what do humans want from the housing. There's various, there's what is there, 5.2 billion humans or something on the planet, and each of them has got a very different perspective on stuff. So I thought it'd be handy to see whether Colby could come and give us his perspective, primarily because of the fact that Colby's a student at university, and he's got a very unique perspective, as well as a friend group that is working through the challenges of studying while still looking at housing and what that means and how difficult or easy that might be to make happen. So thanks, Colby, for coming along. And then, as is normally customary, what we do is we start off with a check-in question, which is primarily designed to help us get on the same page and I suppose be present to have the conversation. So this week, it's what part of a home would you think is important?
It's one of those ones where I think it's going to differ based on anyone's situation, because also some people might not have a part of the home that others do. Same as if you're in a share home, you might not have a part where you class as your part of the home. But I would say in general, the one part which is probably classed as the most important would probably be the kitchen. As when you come around that, you have a lot of the areas which are connected to it. Like you walk into a standard home, the living room's right there, the dining room, and you have all the areas which lead off of the kitchen. And obviously you have the part of the kitchen which brings family together and bring family and friends where you can all collect around and share a meal, cook a meal, share experiences. So I'll definitely say the kitchen's probably the most important part.
I think mine might actually be the bedroom, because to some extent back in prehistory, we may or may not have needed, we've had toilets and showers only really be a fairly modern part of a home. So those things weren't ultimately a part of what was originally housing. And neither to some extent was a kitchen, that we've sort of seen that to some extent, not in the recent history, that was probably even, part of something the servants might have even done. So for me, I think the bedroom is that spot where it's your little sanctuary, and, we definitely all need a place to sleep, and having that security in a place that we can sleep is probably what I see as the most important. But there's no doubt the kitchen's up there as being in the top bunch, so that's good. So today's topic is, what do humans want from their housing? And Rowan has, lucky enough, created this topic some time ago, and I was sort of looking at it before we started the podcast, and I sort of started to break down the bits, and humans is a very wide sort of net. So I thought what we might be able to do is maybe over the next couple of weeks, you've got a unique perspective, obviously being a student, but we might even speak to lots of different humans, just to see what sort of context they're living and how that impacts on what they want from their housing. Obviously we're in Australia, so we'll probably narrow down to humans in Australia that have different experiences. And the second part of that is want from their housing. And I think there's a big distinction to be said, that there's a difference between a want and a need. So starting with the want side of things, asking you a question, if money was not a concern, what would you want from a house?
Well, it's one of those things. It's one of those things where there's a lot of things that you could want from a house, but like you said, there's a big distinction between wanting and needing. So if money's not an issue, I think everyone would have the classic of you would have a bit of a larger house, you would live a bit lavish, have a nice kitchen, also have a good air conditioning system, all the rest of it. But I don't think having an enormous house with a bunch of stuff on top of it is really that much use to me personally. And obviously it's going to be different for everyone. Like I don't have any children and I don't have a large family. So it's not one of those things where I'm not the type of person to go, I want a 3-story house with a massive pool out the back and a large lawn for the kids to run around on, because I'm not put in that situation yet. But I think for me personally, it'd be more one of those ones where I have all the things I need and then I have a couple of things that I've wanted. So obviously for me personally, it'd be having a bit of a bigger bedroom and then having like an ensuite and all the rest of it. That would be phenomenal.
Yep.
And also having a nice living room and all the rest of it would be great. But I think people get a lot mixed up on the money issue when it comes to wants. So I think if people were to ask themselves what they really want from a house and see the realism of it, because a lot of people could say, yeah, I want a 2-story house and lake surrounding my house, but I don't know why you would need that or why you'd actually want that, or if it's just a thing of you just want a status of having that, or if it's a social media based thing. So I think it's one of those ones where I personally wouldn't want that much from it, realistically.
After living in quite a few homes, I'm the same as yourself. I don't think those things, while they look really cool, I think at some point in time you go, hang on. So for me, I think a nice spot would be good. So if money was no issue, I think I'd have a modest house that was small, but I think I'd really like a location that was probably connected to environment. So if I could go for a fish in the backyard, that'd be a pretty good outcome. I reckon that would be probably high on my list. Or some nice natural scenery around or whatever. I suppose moving on from the want side of things, what do you think would be the minimum needs from a housing point of view? If you paired it back, what do you think would be the minimum requirements of this?
So I think the minimum will vary to each person, but I think there's one of those things that people do have rights and they do have things that should be requirements. So one of those things which has been talked about throughout history is humans should have the right to have fresh water and water that isn't going to make them sick. So be able to, for me, go to the tap, turn on the tap and have water is one of those things which most people don't think about it, but is an absolute luxury to a large amount of the world. And the same thing of I can, turn on a fan if it gets too hot, or if it's hot outside, I can go grab something from the fridge. Like that's something which most people in modern day Australia or the rest of it wouldn't even think twice about. But it's one of those things that there's still people who don't have access to fresh water or have to think of. Like there was in India, there was a guy going around in houses and he was cutting holes in roofs and having water bottles, plastic water bottles, cutting the top off of them and making them lights to reflect off sunlight so people could have light inside the hut during the day. So that's something that I saw a water bowl in someone's roof. I think this guy's a lunatic. Why am I in his house? Whereas if for them, that's just, I can now see this is a luxury.
Yeah. Yes, everything has a perspective, doesn't it? I mean, I hadn't really thought about it, but you're right. I mean, we probably take, drinkable water coming to every house as something that we sort of assume that everyone should have. But when you think about it, a lot of the world doesn't have it. But it should be something that is a bit of a, that's a necessity. And I hadn't actually, like in my list, I had actually thought, having a toilet in the bathroom, having an area to prepare food, and then having an area to sleep, with the idea that if you had more space than that, a living area makes sense. But you've said something there that makes a hell of a lot of sense, which you've mentioned the services. So, the ability to have power to your house so you can enjoy other things, the ability to have running water so it's possible that you can have something that is a necessity for life. And then also sewage and the rest of the services to your house is something we take for granted, but is super important. As you said, in medieval times, people were dying from, lack of water and, diseases which come from, not having good services. So that's a really good point. What's the main way that people that your friends that you're with, what's the main sort of housing profile they have, and what's the reason for him ending up like that? Like, are they together in homes, or they by themselves, or and what's the reason why they've ended up in that configuration?
It's one of those things where you have a lot of people where first moving to towns, a lot of time they just went straight into the first thing they could find. But then you also have people who I know who have bounced around a fair bit. So I have a couple friends who I have one or two friends which are in their own unit complex, which they've bought, like they've bought a unit or their parents have bought a unit and they live in that now. I have a group of friends who are also in share houses. Some of them are renting houses together and all the rest of it. So there's been a wide range, but a lot of the time you can see that the main thing that's happened is they've jumped straight at the first chance, which a lot of time is university. places to live and accommodation at uni, which obviously
Yeah.
someone who has no clue what Townsville's like, or someone who might not even know what Australia is like, it seems like a perfect opportunity to go and live right at the place you imagine your whole life will focus around.
Yes.
But the problems that arise in that is a lot of people don't want to live in that situation where, you know, you walk outside of your bedroom and there could be 3 other people. Or if you want to go have a midnight snack of, I don't know, Vegemite toast, you could walk out and there'd be 2 other people in the living room cooking, or all the rest of it. So for a lot of people, that can be a bit of a shell shock I've seen. And there's a lot of people who have had problems with roommates or all the rest of it. But then there's the opposite side of that. We have a lot of friends who joined in rental places together, or have moved into a share home where they already have a friend in it, and it's the complete opposite comparison. So it goes from this view of I hate having to live around these people who I have no clue who they are, to these are my friends and now I get to see them every day. Or, you know, there's been a bunch of times where I've now met people by going to my friends' share homes, and now I'm friends with them. So it's a completely different perspective to what I first would have thought, because my first couple of friends who lived at uni were just like, this is the worst thing, I hate it, I wish I could go back home or live in an apartment. And then I have friends who are in share homes, which is slightly vary, and it's just more of an open area, and it's 10 times better of an environment. So
is that also about diluting the cost a little bit as well? So if you go out with a group of years, you can afford a spot in a better location, or is it just about being together more than anything?
Well, that's actually a really good point, because I have one friend who he's friends with someone at work, and she's recently had a breakup and she can't afford rent by herself. So now he's moving into the house momentarily until they can find a better living arrangement, which works great for him because he's been wanting to move out of his current living situation for a very long time coming. So it's one of those things where a lot of time it can be to mitigate cost and make it better living and more, you know, stress-free environment. But also there's a lot of times of, it's just, sometimes it's better to be around your mates, or sometimes it's better to be around an environment where it feels more of a casual setting than a formal setting. Because when you have your dorms, you have like your own bedrooms, which are all locked up, and then you have a pretty small kitchen area, and then maybe sometimes you'll have like a little bit of a living area which will have 1 or 2 seats, like maybe a half couch and this little TV sitting in the corner. But most of the time in those environments, you see people either are at uni or they're locked in their room. So
is that a bit of a balance as well? You know, like people have that balance between coming out and forming community, or, you know, going and sitting out, having multiple breakout areas. That probably helps with the fact that groups can find their own space and place a little bit, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. Because when you have the thing of, and sometimes you're just going to have that person that is going to put themselves out there and start the conversation with their roommate, or start the conversation with someone in the house. But when it's one of those things of you casually bump into someone, you know, like you walk out of your room and they're cooking and it's right there, it seems pretty normal. But when it's one of those things of they're cooking and they're just going straight back to their room and they don't really want to talk, it's obviously going to make a bit of a collide. So I think it's one of those things where share homes is much more of a viable option for people who want that social interaction. But you're also going to have people who are completely introverted and would rather just do their study and go back home. So it's one of those things where it kind of depends on what you want out of university and what you want out of a home. Because, you know, same with the bare minimum stuff, because some people might just want a bedroom that is just large enough to fit them and maybe a bag, whereas other people might want a fully fledged bedroom with an ensuite. It's just a completely different mindset for both people.
How do you come to agreements in regard to things like, you know, how is the kitchen looked after, or who takes out the rubbish, or that sort of stuff? Is that just sort of informally agreed to or formally agreed to?
Well, I've seen it a couple of times where, you know, even times where I've had to share a house with a mate for a couple of days if they're over for a weekend, or I go over to someone's house for a weekend. It's one of those things that a lot of the time it starts informal and it's just expected. So if you come from a home where it's pretty well sorted, or if there's dishes, you just clean it, or if there's a bit of a mess in the living room, you just tidy it up, you clean your bedroom, stuff like that, there's not really a collide. But when you have a completely different mindset coming in, say someone who has had everything done for them, or has had a dishwasher their whole life, never had to clean a dish by hand, stuff like that. It brings a different mindset. So a lot of time I've seen in my friends' share homes and even in dorms and all the rest of it, for dorms and stuff on uni, there's usually rules. So you'll have like rules where after cooking you clean straight away and you put away your own stuff and you have your own little secluded area where you put your own dishes and all the rest of it. Whereas in
Yes.
share home, I see a lot of the time where you kind of bounce off each other until it gets to a point where there is an issue arises. But I usually by the time it gets to that point, you can pick up if you have half a brain that something's not right. Like every time you cook, the dishes you leave up, like the pan you just used to cook snags, are still there the next day, and then all of a sudden you don't clean it and the pan's gone. Someone has to have cleaned it. So it's going to bring issues eventually if you're not carrying your own weight. So I think it's one of those things of by the time you get to university or by the time you're at the age of thinking about share homes or thinking about living away from your home, you have to have half of a brain by that point, you'd like to hope. Like by that point, you are an adult and you are someone who has responsibilities. So you'd like to think that you can bear those responsibilities of your own. You're like simple stuff like taking out the garbage. If you see it full, just take it out. Or, if you see the recycle is overflowing and boxes keep falling off the top, that means it has to go out. So I think a lot of the time it's pretty well sorted because a lot of people have an understanding of simple stuff, but at the same time, you're going to have people who just want a home to live in and don't really care about the rest of it.
That makes a lot of sense. Another question that I have is, and this is something we've thought about when we have, so ultimately people purpose place is about what happens if we thought about the idea that people were going to live together and specially design the home so it suited everyone's need, but still had some shared ways that you could all come together, but higher levels of privacy, so it's still important for you. One of the things, and you've just mentioned sort of to some extent the groups of people go, hey, these are my mates and I might go and stay with them. But what happens if that changes? Like, and I know you've experienced this yourself, is what happens if a person in the house is a single and then they get into a relationship? Like, how is that dealt with inside a household? Like, is that something that's just not talked about, or is it actively discussed, or is it just implied versus explicit? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that can become an issue to certain groups. So obviously I have friends who are in share homes, which is exclusively to one gender. So it's obviously so that's where you have like places where it's not drama filled. So you'll have just a female house. And then like I know from a couple of mates that there's this, one of the houses that my friend lives in. So she's in a house which is fully female. There's no male in the house. And then the other house, which is owned by the same guy, is a fully male house.
Yeah, right.
So obviously those two houses will have social interactions because they obviously live right next to each other. But by that nature, you're not going to have issues of, people in the house, drama, all the rest of it. But when it comes into things like even in that environment where it is, just say an all-female house, someone gaining a partner may have a bit of tension or it may cause a bit of confusion. Or, if you're just a person who likes to walk around in comfy clothing, or say if you're a bloke, you just want to walk around, or even a female, you want to walk around with your shirt off or just in the singlet or all the rest of it, if you all of a sudden another person is coming to the house, that's obviously going to create a bit of discomfort for you because you can't go by your day-to-day routine if you're constantly worrying about I'm going to walk out my bedroom because I want to go get something from the kitchen and someone from the opposite gender or someone I don't know is there.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of the things where it kind of relies on the person who has that partner as well as the partner of itself. So I know personally that if you walk into a situation like that and you're just secluded and you kind of ignore anyone else in the house and don't ever contribute to conversation or cleaning up or, minding your own business, respecting people's privacy, that's obviously going to create a huge, gap between communication and also create a problem and tension inside the home. But if you're, understanding the fact that, you're new to the home, this isn't your house, or, there's people who have privacy and you just take that into consideration, a problem won't arise. It's just one of those things you have to understand that not everyone is in the same mindset as you. So you might come in and go to your girlfriend's house, which is an all-girl house, and go, yep, I'm staying in her room and then I'll come to the kitchen and cook dinner with her and then I'll go back, all the rest of it. But if you don't even think about the fact that there's other people included in that situation, such as her two friends who live in the house, or, you know, there's a couple other girls in the house that are constantly moving around, or there's someone using the kitchen at the same time as you, you have to be understanding that that's not your environment to start claiming upon. So, yeah.
In those homes, how do people deal with the fact that, you know, most a normal home probably has, you know, 2 or 3 bedrooms that are working off one bathroom, and one room has an ensuite. So what do you just have a punch up to find out who gets the ensuite, or how does that work?
Well, I see a lot of the time with the situation of a share home is that the owner will put it up on some type of marketplace where rental properties are available. And for a lot of time,
Yep.
I know there's ones where it's specifically designed for just students and just university and people between a certain age. So, you know, if you're an 18-year-old bloke, you're not walking around and there's a 40-year-old man having a smoke in the backyard. Like, obviously, that would
Yes.
create a divide as its own. So,
Yeah.
From my understanding, a lot of the time it's you have the owner of the house when they're renting the property or renting different rooms is that the ensuite will cost more rent per fortnight or per week.
Okay.
And then if someone in the house, say like you're moving here and someone already has the ensuite room, or if there's 2 ensuite rooms and they're both taken and you want to still live in that
Yep.
house, you're just going to have to realize that you're going to have to share a bathroom and, you know, toilet area. Like that's just something you're going to have to share. So a lot of the time I've seen
Yes.
that it's just one of those things where if you're willing to pay the bit of an extra buck to get that own personal ensuite, you're going to get that. Or, you know, if you're just okay with having a smaller room and have to share a bathroom, all the rest of it, well, then that's just what you're going to have to live with.
Yeah, and I've got a comment there too that I suppose is based upon the size of the kitchen, which makes a lot of sense too. You know, like ultimately, if you've got room to have more of your own space, then you can put stuff in there if you're jammed in together. And obviously, as you said, it depends on the type of community. I'd imagine if you're a really close group of people, probably on the weekend when maybe the roster isn't quite as tight, it gives a bit of an opportunity to have some shared meals, or, you know, deal with that
Absolutely.
as it needs to. I wonder also from that point of view, are people dealing, like, have you seen people had to actually deal with proper proper conflict? Does that happen where people have had to work through, hey, you're being a dickhead, or you're doing this thing that is really pissing me off, or whatever the case? Does that happen a lot, or is that something that's normally sorted out so it doesn't escalate to that point? Or
Yeah, usually to the point where I've never seen any, I've never heard either from any of my friends where it's gotten to the point of a roommate doing something so crazy, which has ended up pissing them off to the point of they need to have a word with them. A
yeah,
lot of the time, I think it's falls back to one of those things of just understanding your environment. But
yes,
usually, by the time it gets to the point of if someone's constantly doing something and it's getting to the point where, you know, say they're making a huge mess in the kitchen or they're spilling shit everywhere every single time they go into the kitchen, and you've talked to them about it, or you cleaned up a couple of times and it's not being fixed and they're not changing their behavior. I've seen a lot of times where it just goes straight to the
yeah,
landlord's decision to make that. Because if a landlord comes down and has a conversation with that roommate and says, look, you're not pulling your weight, all the rest of it, that's definitely going to have much more of an impact than someone in your household just saying, hey, look, clean up after yourself. Like usually you would think human decency, if you make a mess, you clean up after yourself, but there's always going to be that fair mix of people mixed.
yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of different web pages and even apps and all the rest of it that are designed for just student accommodation, because that's obviously a large field of rental properties. But there's also the thing
Yeah,
of it becomes a bit of a challenge for a lot of uni students, because usually if you say have a group of 5 friends or all the rest of it and you guys want to go rent a share house together, a lot of times when you see a landlord or someone who's offering a rental property such as a whole home, and they see 4
yeah,
uni students applying for a home, I've seen a lot of times where friends who applied for it haven't gotten it because the landlord thinks they won't be financially stable, or they won't be able to afford rent, or they won't be able to keep up with household activities and all the rest of it, because they're put in an environment where it's already stinged based on, paying for uni as well as paying for books, paying for fuel, paying for classes, all the rest of it. So stuff like that ties
Yeah.
into your, obviously the amount of money you have available to spend. And then plus, if you don't have a job and you're just living off, some type of Centrelink payment, or living off something that your, parents send you twice a month or whatever it is, that's obviously going to create another huge problem in the area. So I think a lot of the time it varies on what you can get, because obviously if people are open up to students renting from their home or students renting from a student-based accommodation, it's obviously not going to create much of a problem. But if you, as the landlord who want to be able to have a constant income of people who are renting at your house, and you see 3 uni students, your main point of view isn't going to be, oh, these people are going to keep up with payments and they're going to be on the ball and they're going to be able to afford this fully. If, say, it's a large home and rents 1,000 a week or 800 a week, usually you won't think that 3 or 4 uni students can afford
And
that.
flowing on from that, obviously going to university is a stressful thing at the at any extent, and we've seen a lot of stuff around the whole idea of mental well-being tied up with housing. So do you think if things aren't right, that having poor housing puts a lot of stress back onto particularly students?
Absolutely. I think that putting yourself in an environment where it's only going to be damaging, it's only going to be add more stress to already stressful environment, is going to make your mental health go downhill. Like if you're one of those people where, like I know myself personally with anxiety, that small things can sometimes be the tipping point, and even large things may just add on top of the problem. So, if you're a university student stressed out about an exam, or you're tight on money because this week of pay did not do too well, all the rest of it, and then if you have to worry about, say, a high cost of rent, or if you're going back home and you want to just cook a nice meal but the kitchen's a wreck, like that's obviously going to impact how you're feeling based on that situation. So I do think that environments that can be stressful will obviously impact your day-to-day life and even your mental health overall.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and that's something we see quite regularly. People are not having stable housing is on top of all the other stresses in life a massive impact for people, and that's what we're hoping. And it's great to really hear these stories and understand a bit more in depth of what students go through, both the challenges of trying to find rentals in a stressed market at the best of times, but then the individual challenges that happen there. But one thing I am impressed with is the ability for you guys to all work together, because it would seem that that environment can be quite high pressured and all that other stuff. But by the sounds of it, if you pick the right people, you can find a way to find a household arrangement that can work quite well. So one of the, and to some extent, we talk about this idea of creating avatars who might be able to get benefit from People Purpose Place. And we think maybe students are that one of those groups as well. So whether it be parents helping them out or investors who are maybe being socially responsible, trying to design homes specifically for the benefit of students, and maybe parents joining together to try and find a place that we can make sure that the kids going through the process, young adults and adults going through the process of learning so they can come back and help our society, that should be an easier process than what it is now, where it seems like there's just obstacle after obstacle. So it's been awesome for you to be able to fill in the picture and provide a bit more of an understanding for us on what that can look like. So I appreciate you filling in that picture.